Okay, everyone. Well, because this is sort of a fill-in, sort of last-minute-y thing, it's more of an actual background to Acts that I'll be talking about with ideas that I already had. Some you might not agree with, but I hope at least you'll find them interesting. So here we go. I'll be talking about the connections between Luke and Acts. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Just wave.
Yep.
Yeah, it's all right. The connection between Luke and Acts, who was Theophilus, who they're both written to. Oh, sorry about that. How we got the tradition that Luke was the author of both books, and the exciting connections with Manaen, Herod, and others. Okay, so to begin, the connection between Luke and Acts. So it's fairly universally accepted that they were written by the same author. So Luke begins by saying, "Many have undertaken to compose a narrative of the things that have been fulfilled among us," and some versions say, "as they were handed down," giving the impression that this information happened prior. But actually, about half the translations, and I think it's more accurate, say, "even as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word delivered them to us." So this doesn't mean they were handed down, but they were just given. The word means given to us. So someone else might have seen things and told us about them, not from a distant past, but a contemporary. "Therefore, having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught." Okay, I'm just going to move these pictures in my way. So Acts begins, "In my first word, O Theophilus." So we've got this connection to Theophilus. We've got O Theophilus in Acts and most excellent Theophilus in Luke. So they're written to the same person. Acts talks about the first word, which is obviously what Luke was. Luke was, oh, that's sorry. I'm going to get rid of this phone. Hang on. Acts was the first word that he's referring to. And then Luke ends with, "And behold, I'm sending you the promise of my Father upon you. You remain in the city Jerusalem until you've been clothed with power from on high." And Acts actually starts with the same idea. Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift the Father promised, which is the gift of the Holy Spirit that Luke was talking about. So we've got this obvious connection between the two books. So it's pretty without doubt that the same author wrote them both. So we've got a part one and a part two, as it were. And as Professor Stephen Vorwin said, Luke Acts is one story in two parts, and the two are meant to be read as one. So it's kind of like 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, part one, part two. And it's really a shame that we've got the Gospel of John in the middle, separating them. Another little point, point of trivia, is that this group together, Acts, Luke, by the one author, comprises approximately 28% of New Testament writings, which is actually more than all the writings of Paul combined. So the author of Luke Acts wrote most of the New Testament. So who was Theophilus that it's addressed to? Well, I don't know if you all remember or were present, but in about 2012, Mary Mansfield gave us a really interesting talk about this at Sisters class. It was called "Joanna and Theophilus, a proposal in the formation of the Luke Acts unit." She actually went on to present it at the Bible, some Bible Society in Chicago. Oh, here we are. I've written it. The Society of Biblical Literature in Chicago, after she gave the talk to us. So from an ossuary that, hang on, I'll find my notes. So in 1984, the Department of Israeli Antiquities acquired what appears to be an authentic ossuary with the title on it saying Joanna, daughter of Johanan, son of Theophilus, the high priest. And this, excuse me, well, there weren't too many high priests. In fact, there was only one who had a son called Jonathan. And the name Theophilus is very uncommon amongst the Jews. In fact, it's rare, in fact. So this combination is only found on this ossuary, which is a bone box, and in the Gospel of Luke. I actually wrote to my Facebook friend, Robin Cohen, who's a Jewish historical author, and asked her what she thought of all this information. So she was really interested and looked into it too. And she said that this type of ossuary was only made between about 100 BC and 100 AD. And she said in the case of Joanna, both the chronology and geography matched what we know in the Gospel of Luke and the ossuary. And she pointed out that only wealthy had ossuaries, and from our account in Luke, we know that Joanna was wealthy. So everything, all the evidence stacks up. So I find this really convincing that it's Luke, the Gospel of Luke and Acts were written to Theophilus, the high priest. And someone made this comment: from situating Luke's Gospel as a communication to the high priest, a dramatically new reading of the Luke-Acts unit unfolds. And it does too. You pick up all the things, the very Jewishness of the references to the priests and the witness to them that this Jesus was the Messiah that you've been looking for. Okay, so if we accept that Theophilus was the high priest, it makes sense of the title in Luke, Most Excellent Theophilus, written to Theophilus while he's in the office of priesthood. So that when we come to Acts, it just says, in my first word, O Theophilus. So I think what's happened here is Luke was written while he's in office, so he's referred to as most excellent, and Acts is written afterwards when he's just an ordinary person again. So Theophilus was in office from 37 to 41 CE. So this actually gives us a date when Luke was written, like if we accept this theory. And it's an earlier date than most put. So say, I don't know, might have been written about 38 CE. It's really interesting that this period coincides with the peaceful reading in the church that we read in Acts 9:31. It says, then the church throughout Judea, Galilee and Samaria experienced a time of peace. It grew in strength and numbers, living in the fear of the Lord and the encouragement of the Holy Spirit. So you can imagine if Theophilus is a priest who's interested in God and Jesus, and he won't be running around persecuting Christians, and it just all seems to line up really nicely. So, there's my notes again. Okay, it also makes sense of Joanna being included as a witness to this Theophilus, if she was his granddaughter. and she was from one of the wealthiest families in Judea in the 1st century, the family of Annas. And so, yeah, she'd be a local person known to the writer of the 3rd Gospel. And so it would make sense too of what we read in Luke 8. These women supported them out of their personal resources. And if she's related to Theophilus, it also makes her related to Caiaphas, because his sister was Joanna's great aunt, which makes sense of what we read in John 18. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple, unnamed. And I believe a lot of the unnamed disciples are actually women. That disciple was known to the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. So I think we can add Joanna to the picture there. And I think she was the one that said to the servant, "Open the door and let Peter in," because she would have known them all. So let's look at her family tree. We've got Annas, the high priest, up the top there. We've got Joanna down the bottom, her grandfather Theophilus, and an unnamed daughter of Annas, who was the sister of Theophilus. And look at that little note, married Caiaphas. So that, we've got all these interesting connections. Okay, so that was my uncontroversial bit. Now we'll go to the controversial bit. How we got the tradition that Luke was the author. So I've been looking at the authorship of all the Gospels for a long time, and been aware when I was looking at the 4th Gospel how dodgy these attributions that they were the people that wrote them are. And in fact, a lot of modern scholars, they don't trust these attributions of authorship anymore. Wikis summed them up by saying, the earliest manuscripts are anonymous and the traditional view has been challenged by many modern scholars. If another notable person, specialist in ancient history, Christian origins, said, our sources for these claims, authorship of Gospels, are not renowned for their reliability. So I'm going to take a look at sort of the history of the reliability here. Let's say this is ground zero. The Gospel of Luke was written maybe in 38 AD. Manaen pops up in about 150 AD. He used the Gospel of Luke. It's actually, there was a lot of conflict between him and Tertullian, although Manaen was dead. But we know what he wrote from the writings of the Church Fathers, who really hated what he had written and done, because his popularity grew amazingly and he was like rivaling the Orthodox Church, or his followers were. So he used the Gospel of Luke with no attribution of authorship. It was known amongst his followers as the Gospel of the Lord. There were slight differences where he'd left out some of the Jewishness of it, which they really picked on as well. And then after him, well, no, actually at the same time, we had Justin Martyr, who also quoted from most of the Gospels, but he didn't refer to them by any name, just called them the Memoirs of the Apostles. So it's not until we come to Irenaeus in about 180 that these attributions of authorship are in writing. Irenaeus said there are only 4 Gospels because there are 4 corners of the universe, 4 principal winds, so there must be 4 Gospels. And he linked them to the apostolic succession, and we read about that in his writings against heresies. And just after him, we've got Tertullian, prolific writings from him, who endorsed an apostolic succession, men only for bishops and gospels, all with the right connections. And and eventually he said scripture should be taken out of the hands of common people, and that actually only authorized bishops could read it at all. And he wrote that in 208 CE. We've got specific dates you can tie it to. Okay, so let's read an example of what Tertullian wrote. This really gives us insight into the thinking of these church fathers. We lay it down as our first position that the Evangelical Testament has apostles for its authors, to whom was assigned by the Lord himself this office of publishing the gospel. Since, however, there are apostolic men also, they are yet not alone, but appear with apostles and after apostles, because the preaching of disciples might be open to the suspicion of an affectation of glory, if there did not accompany it the authority of the masters, which means that of Christ, for it was that which made the apostles their masters. Of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instill faith into us, whilst of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterwards. Marcion, on the other hand, you must know, ascribes no author to his gospel, as if it could not be allowed him to affix a title to that from which it was no crime to subvert the very body. And here I might now make a stand and contend that a work ought not to be recognised which holds not its head erect, which exhibits no consistency, which gives no promise of credibility from the fullness of its title and the just profession of its author. So you can see their way of thinking. But we can tell by other ways the unreliability of this church propaganda. These were the same people that said that Peter and Paul founded the church in Rome. Irenaeus, that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. But we know that Paul didn't found the church at Rome with Peter, because he says in Romans, making it my aim to preach the gospel not where Christ was already named, that I might not build upon another man's foundation. Therefore, I was hindered these many times from coming to you. So Paul is saying someone else had founded the church in Rome, and he wasn't going to build on someone else's foundation. And there's no evidence of Peter being in Rome. The little bit in Peter where people say, oh, Babylon is code for Rome, I think is nonsense. The church persecution was only fairly minor under Nero. It wasn't any cause for this code for Rome business, and the persecution was much more after that. And Babylon, I've even heard it in a Christadelphian talk by an English brother, that Babylon, it was definitely Rome, because Babylon had fizzled out by this time to fulfill the prophecy that Babylon would be no more. But that's absolute nonsense. Babylon lasted till about 1000 AD. And there was in fact, most of the Jews still lived in Babylon. There was a huge center of learning. They had 3 Jewish universities there, and that's where they produced the Babylonian Talmud in 500 AD. So when Peter sends greetings from Babylon, it makes absolute sense. He would go to his fellow Jews in Babylon and preach to them. There's no need to make it Rome. So this myth that Peter and Paul founded the church in Rome shows the unreliability of these. These are the same people we're trusting that these Matthew, Mark and Luke, John wrote the Gospels. They just wanted apostolic good links. So here's a well-accredited professor saying, why were the Gospels written anonymously? This guy's an expert in textual criticism, among other things. He said, it appears that the authors of the New Testament Gospels may have been influenced by the pattern of anonymity in the Old Testament narratives, because most of the Old Testament is likewise anonymous. So Greek and Roman authors identified themselves, wishing credit for their works. Did the authors of the New Testament Gospels think it inappropriate to identify themselves as the authors of these texts, wishing instead simply to foreground the contents and simply serve the message cause? And so I think he's nailed it on the head here with those comments. I think that's exactly why they left their messages anonymous. And we'll just read what, so the message of what's in the Bible, their message is in stark contradiction to this thinking of church fathers. The gospel writers were defined by what they are, not who they are. So, for example, when they questioned John the Baptist, "Who are you?" he said, "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness." He didn't want recognition for himself. He just wanted to be a voice with witnessing a message. When the Pharisees said to Jesus, "If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly," Jesus replied, "The works I do in my Father's name testify about me." The author of the second gospel, he actually titled it, "This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." So I don't know why we had to give it a different name. And then the author of the first gospel went to a lot of trouble to not identify themselves, but as the person, but as a beloved disciple. So there's such a powerful message here. And I think if you don't take anything else out of this, take the message that it's people that glory in academic qualifications and your connections and who you are. But the message of the Bible is glory in God. Let it be about God and not yourself. So just have a drink. So is it likely that Luke wrote the third gospel? He's actually included at the end of in the prison passages. We've got our dear friend Luke the doctor and Demas send greetings in Colossians. Demas and Luke, my fellow workers in Philemon, and only Luke is with me in 2 Timothy when it was almost the end for Paul. So these are all written quite late. So I want to look at someone I think might have written it with the exciting connections with Manaen. He's actually in Antioch at the right time when the we passages occur in Acts. So the we passages make it obvious that whoever's writing it was part of it. They were there at the time. We don't have any evidence that Luke was there, but we do that Manaen was there. Manaen has connections to Galilee when the third gospel was written, and connections that could link him to Theophilus. Okay, so there's only one verse written about Manaen, but it's a pretty power-packed little verse. In Acts 13, it says, "Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul." I mean, that's pretty amazing. Has anyone ever noticed how important brought up with Herod the Tetrarch is? So I checked out this word "brought up with" to see what it means. It's not used anywhere else in the Bible, so I had to look at other sources. And it always means actually raised with, as a foster brother, that idea, exactly as it sounds. First Maccabees says, "He summoned his most honoured officers who had been brought up with him from youth." So that's the idea. So we get a few points from this. It places him at Antioch with the we passages. he was a prophet and or teacher, was brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. So this means he'd have the best education and probably the same address as Herod. So here's just a map to show you where Antioch is, where Manaen was with Saul in Acts 13. And then the we passages occur over here, beginning at Troas, Philippi, Neapolis. But these guys were all traveling around, even though it doesn't specify that Manaen was over at Troas. It doesn't say that Luke was there either, and we only hear of Luke 8 years later. Oh, that's another Antioch. It makes it all more confusing. Yeah, so Luke is first mentioned with Paul 8 years after all this happened. Okay, so let's look again at Joanna's family tree. Here she is. She married Chusa, who was Herod's steward. So if Herod was brought up with Manaen, I think there's like a good chance he's still hanging around with Manaen. So there would be this connection between Joanna, Chusa, and Manaen. They all moved in the same circles. The Herods were all known to the priests. They were sort of a close group. And so it's very likely Manaen would have known this Theophilus, and he would have known that Joanna was his granddaughter, and he would have heard of the encounters of Joanna. And so when he's writing Luke, he's relaying information from Joanna and from himself. I think he was around at the time. So when it says Manaen was brought up with Herod, I've got a little quote about what they would have learned, if I can find it, but I seem to have lost it. Anyway, here we go. So Herod was sent away as a child to Rome for his education. So I think Manaen would have gone to Rome with him. Herod was the son of Herod the Great, who was king at the time and in very good favor with the Romans. He could actually be quite charming when he wanted to. So I'm sure that his son, Herod Petrarch, would have had the finest education, as would Manaen. So apparently between 9 and 12 years of age, boys from affluent families would further their studies with a special grammaticus who honed his students' writing and speaking skills, versed them in the art of poetic analysis, and taught them Greek if they didn't yet know it. And we've got commentaries about the quality of writing of Acts and Luke. It says, along with the epistle to Hebrews, Luke Acts is of the best Greek in the New Testament. Another comment, his Greek was as polished as that of such classical writers as Xenophon. So of course, I never realized that just from reading Luke and Acts, but obviously we lose something in the translation into English. Apparently it was a very high standard of writing, which if Manaen was schooled with the best teachers in Rome, that also makes a lot of sense. Okay, my final thought is the connection that Chusa could be the nobleman's son who we read about in John 4. The word nobleman it actually should be royal official. They were connected to royalty as it was in Capernaum. That was Herod's territory, as you can see on the little map. The yellow bit, Galilee, bordering on the Sea of Tiberias. That's Capernaum up there. This was under Herod's control. So if you've got a royal official, he's connected to Herod. So I better get my notes again. So I'm not the first one to suggest this. A lot of people have thought it could be the same person, and it would explain Joanna traveling the countryside as a follower of Jesus if it was her son who was healed. No wonder Chusa didn't mind his wife roaming the countryside with Jesus if Jesus had healed his son. So when we're told that it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna who he delivered from evil spirits and various diseases, it may not have been Joanna herself who was cured, but she'd been delivered, part of the healings of Jesus, delivered from evil spirits and diseases because he'd healed her son. That makes sense to me. So this would make the whole story sort of fit. And oh yeah, this goes a little bit further, that Chusa and Joanna may in fact be Andronicus and Junia, who are mentioned in Romans, where we read, "Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow countrymen and fellow prisoners. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was." So how come we don't know who they are if they were like there for a long time and outstanding among the apostles? Well, the name Junia is actually the same as Joanna. It's just the Latin form, and they sounded the same. And the word, I think the word Chusa was a nickname. It's a name that's not used anywhere in the Old Testament or anywhere else in the New Testament. It's a very uncommon. In fact, Chusa is the only person I could find with the name, but it means the seer, or which means a seer, someone who sees. And Jesus said to the royal official, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." Then Jesus told him, "Go back home, your son will live." And the man believed. He saw the signs, but before he saw the signs, he believed. This is great faith. In fact, this is the very first healing that Jesus did. It was not long after he turned the water to wine. So he would be great among the apostles. He's the first one to believe without seeing. And so, in fact, he's a seer by faith. So I think very appropriate for a nickname, the seer. Why would Chusa and Joanna end up in Rome? Well, in 39 AD, I think Chusa would have lost his job because Herod was exiled to Spain, and I think it was Agrippa was put in his place. Perhaps with Manaen there and his Roman connections, he might have had friends in Rome. Don't know, but there seems enough connections to make this story all fit. So that's about it. That was just a chart to show the time sequence that was more for my benefit than anyone else's. So that's just a bit of my background information to all of that.
Wow.
So I hope you found that interesting. It is quite speculative, but I like looking at speculative things.